At 62, when talking about the immortal legends of the NBA, America can't leave out the name Hakeem Olajuwon, the only man in history to win MVP, Defensive Player of the Year, and Finals MVP in the same season, the rare center who could defend like a steel wall and attack with the softness of a ballet dancer on hardwood. He was the soul of back-to-back championships in 1994, 1995, the one who turned the Houston Rockets from a doubted team into a glorious empire. His dream shake wasn't just a move, it was a language of art, a symbol of elegance, that even legends like Shaquille O'Neal and David Robinson had to bow to in respect. From a Nigerian kid, who didn't even know what basketball was, to becoming the most complete center America has ever seen, that journey didn't just write a sporting legacy, it was powerful proof that the immigrant dream can break every limit if it's built on discipline, faith, and humility. But behind all that glory, behind the bronze statue in front of Toyota Center, behind the championship banners hanging from the rafters, is a truth the crowd never saw. At 62, Hakeem walks slowly through Houston like a man talking to time itself. The body that was once his pride now betrays him constantly. A dull backache that turns every morning into a battle, knees that sting with every heavy step, and eyesight fading so badly that reading the Quran, the most sacred thing in his life, has become a painful struggle. When the city sinks into night, his huge house has no roar of fans, no squeak of sneakers, only a silence heavy enough to crush the heart of a man who spent his whole life fighting. And in those quiet hours, the longing for Nigeria comes rushing back like a storm, missing parents who passed away while he was on the other side of the ocean, missing the morning call to prayer, missing the smell of earth, wind, and the hometown of his childhood. His career took him to the top, but it also stole the ordinary moments he can never get back. Yet even as his body weakens and memories of home weigh on his shoulders, Hakeem's will never goes out. He still trains lightly every day, still prays even with failing eyes, still lives with the same discipline as if every day is a gift to be treasured. His tragedy isn't the weakening of his body, it's the unbreakable resilience, a heart that has tasted every glory and keeps fighting in silence. If you believe Hakeem's legacy deserves to be told in full, hit subscribe to walk with us. And to understand why a legend can carry such extraordinary strength inside him, we have to go back to where it all began, a childhood not abandoned, but forged in fire. In 1960s, 1970s Lagos, where Hakeem Olajuwon let out his first cry, life wasn't a gentle fairy tale, it was a harsh painting, where horns, shouting, street vendors, and metal clanging in workshops mixed into the chaotic soundtrack of a city that never slept. Lagos back then was where poverty and violence lived side by side, where every intersection had its own story, where a kid could grow up overnight, or disappear in an instant. The Olajuwon family wasn't the poorest in the neighborhood, but they weren't well off either. His parents worked almost all day running a small local cement factory. In that world, Hakeem never knew a carefree childhood, only duty. While other kids were playing marbles or kicking a ball in the dust, young Hakeem spent more time bent over than standing straight, lifting cement bags heavier than his own body, carrying water from the well to the factory, hauling tools, running back and forth between the shop and home just to make the day's deliveries. Every drop of sweat on the scorching cement floor didn't just build muscle faster than his peers, it planted a constant anxiety in his soul, a special kind of childhood wound that belongs to kids raised in hardship, always afraid of not having enough, afraid of mistakes, afraid of not being good enough, afraid of letting his parents down. And on top of the pressure for daily bread was another, quieter, heavier pressure: religion. In the Olajuwon home, Islam wasn't just belief, it was discipline. Young Hakeem had to pray on time, behave perfectly, become the perfect man in the eyes of the community. One small mistake was enough to be seen as unworthy. At an age when other kids cried over a scraped knee or a lost toy, Hakeem cried silently under the weight of becoming something bigger than himself. Lagos had no mercy for weakness. The streets where he grew up were full of shouting, market arguments, little scuffles that could turn into fights at any second. He learned to walk fast, keep his head down, stay alert. In that world, safety wasn't a right, it was luck. And right there, Hakeem learned the two lessons that later made a legend: nobody is coming to save you, and God only helps those who help themselves first. Sometimes under the burning tin roof of the factory, that boy would look out at the dusty road and dream of somewhere else, somewhere without cement, without shouting, without nights when his parents came home so late he fell asleep on the floor. But even that dream was crushed by duty. From a young age he was taught that boys don't complain, don't show weakness, so every loneliness, every longing, every fear, he buried deep inside. On the outside a strong, quiet, devout kid, on the inside a storm that never got a name. Nobody in Lagos back then knew the errand boy in the little cement factory was about to step into a destiny that would take him to America, to the NBA, to a peak the world would bow to. They only saw a silent, hard-working kid who always did more than his share, not knowing that every step was taking him away from childhood and toward a life no one could imagine. And so in the suffocating heat of Lagos, a legend was forged in fire, without the boy himself even realizing it. And then, when fate opened a different door for that boy, a door to America, Hakeem Olajuwon stepped through it without knowing that behind the light of opportunity waited days of loneliness so intense it took his breath away. At 18, the first time his feet touched Houston soil, it felt like his soul had been ripped from the ground he knew. Nigeria, dusty, loud, full of spice smells and people breathing the same air, suddenly turned into skyscrapers, strange roads, faces that couldn't understand a word he said. Different language, different weather, different food, different rhythm of life. Everything hit him like a punch to the heart, making him realize he no longer belonged to the place he'd left. But he didn't belong to the place he'd just arrived either, like being exiled from his old life but not yet accepted into the new one. The University of Houston in the early 1980s wasn't gentle territory for a young African guy. In his tiny dorm room, Hakeem lay on an old metal bed, listening to the tired spin of the ceiling fan, the cars outside, and felt loneliness boiling up like a fever. Homesickness gripped his chest like a hand squeezing. Missing his mother's voice, the smell of hot rice, dawn prayers, familiar faces now half a world away. His first night in Houston, Hakeem cried, not from fear but because for the first time in his life he truly felt completely alone. Day after day the lost feeling grew. In class he spoke slowly while everyone else spoke fast. In the cafeteria he couldn't stomach American food. On the practice court he was clumsy in a sport he'd barely touched. No friends, no guide, nobody who understood where he came from or what he carried inside. Other students laughed, made plans, went out. Hakeem, he walked back to the dorm in silence, dropped his bag, sat alone, listened to a city that didn't feel like any part of it belonged to him. And in that isolation, the invisible scars of the immigrant started to form, feeling lost, afraid of mistakes, afraid of standing out, afraid of judgment. He shrank into himself, as if breathing too loud would make everyone stare. But fate gave Hakeem no choice. Coach Guy Lewis, who saw in him not just a raw athlete, but a rough stone that could be polished into a diamond, dragged him into a brutal training regimen. No sweet talk, no softness, just work, just orders, just days longer than Lagos summers and runs that left him drained. Guy Lewis pushed him past limits, as if testing whether this skinny kid from Africa really deserved to stay in America. Mornings run until his legs gave out, afternoons post moves until his arms shook, nights defense, jumping, spinning until his breath cut like knives in his lungs. Many times he collapsed on the gym floor and couldn't get up. Many times he went to the bathroom, locked the door, let the shower run to hide the sound of crying, and wash away weakness he refused to let anyone see. He cried from exhaustion, from missing home, from feeling he didn't belong here. But every time the tears stopped, he wiped his face, stood up, opened the door, and walked back out like nothing happened. Because the only thing he could hold on to in those months swallowed by loneliness was himself. Houston didn't embrace him. Nobody reached out a hand. But that same cold, harsh Houston forged him the same way Lagos had, by fire. And in the darkness of the dorm, through sleepless nights, an 18-year-old from Africa began to understand to survive in a foreign land, he had to become the fire itself. And right in those months, swallowed by loneliness on foreign soil, another fire started burning in Hakeem. A fire that didn't come from encouragement or praise, but from the pain of being looked down on. Those first practices in Houston were a slap to his pride. To many people, Hakeem was just an awkward international kid, raw, slow, doesn't belong. Those words weren't just technical critiques, they were invisible knives cutting into the heart of a young man trying to find his place in a strange world. And every time he heard them, he pulled inward a little more, but also grew harder. He knew that if he let those words become truth, his journey would end right there. So instead of arguing or making excuses, Hakeem chose the only path Logos had taught him: work until nobody had the breath left to doubt him. From then on, the gym became his only shelter, the one place loneliness couldn't touch him, where prejudice couldn't reach, where he could reforge himself like steel in a furnace. On nights when Houston fell quiet, when classmates were asleep, and the hallway lights were just a dim, sickly yellow, Hakeem slipped into the gym with legs still burning from the morning run. He didn't train to impress, not to be praised. He trained to survive, to not be swallowed by this country, to prove to himself he deserved to stay. Many nights he slept right on the cold gym floor, towel for a pillow, jersey for a blanket, feet blistered so bad his sweaty shoes never dried, joints swollen red, knees burning, chest aching like it was being crushed after every conditioning drill. But every morning he got up, tied his shoes and started again. No complaints, no whining. If the Logos boy once faced sweat and cement, the Houston man now faced iron plates, hill sprints that made him throw up, endless jumps until he couldn't feel his legs. And through all of it, one thing never changed: prayer. Every night before sleep, or before stepping into the gym, Hakeem knelt toward Mecca, closed his eyes, and asked for strength not to quit. In a foreign country, in a culture that wasn't his, on long nights when nobody called his name, faith was the only rope pulling him back from the edge. Logos taught him discipline, Islam taught him patience, Houston taught him endurance, and those three things fused together to create the man Hakeem became. Then the first spins started appearing, slow, rough, unpolished, but they carried something no coach could teach: the story of a soul fighting prejudice. Every spin was defiance against the mocking words. Every pump fake was defiance against not belonging. Every shoulder drop right then explode, left was defiance against the homesickness choking his chest. Little by little the move grew smoother, deeper, trickier, as if Hakeem was no longer controlling his body with muscle, but with memory, with pain, with nights left alone in a cold dorm, with nights collapsed on the gym floor unseen. The dream shake, the move the world would later worship, wasn't born from genius. It was born from loneliness, from the shame of being underrated, from fear of failing far from home, from the strange mix of brutal drills, choked back memories of Nigeria, and whispered midnight prayers. It was the language of a man carving his name into the world, one cut at a time, turning every hurt into art. And on those pitch-black Houston nights, when Hakeem spun again under the dim yellow lights, nobody, not even he himself, knew that move would carry his name into immortality. And then when the dream shake spins started taking shape, when the name Olajuwon was no longer a question mark on the roster, Hakeem stepped out of the gym shadows into the NBA spotlight, where the light is so bright it can burn anyone who isn't strong enough. But for Hakeem, light was never a refuge. It was just a new test, a brighter but crueler kind of loneliness. In the 1985-1986 season, the Houston Rockets became a phenomenon. The Twin Towers duo, Hakeem and Ralph Sampson, drove America crazy. They were called the future of the NBA, the next empire after the Lakers and Celtics, and in that frenzy, Hakeem, the kid who once slept in the gym, suddenly became the hope of a city starving for glory. But first, glory didn't taste sweet like people think. It came like a storm, carrying both expectation and crushing pressure. Every game, every step on the court, every glance at the clock, Hakeem felt millions of eyes demanding every point, every block, every spin be perfect according to the picture they'd painted. And when the Rockets reached the 1986 NBA Finals, that light became blindingly painful. Houston had never gone that far. To the people, Hakeem was no longer just a player, he was the man carrying the city's collective prayer on his back. But basketball, like fate, is crueler than people admit. That finals ended in defeat, a defeat that left the city silent. In the days after, Houston papers wrote that the Rockets weren't ready, that the Twin Towers collapsed, and in those criticisms arrows flew straight at Hakeem. He's not enough. He can't lead. He's not the superstar they hoped. Simple words, but falling on the heart of someone who had already lived spiritual exile in a foreign land, they cut deeper than any on-court collision. That was the first time Hakeem felt the tragedy of rising. The better you get, the lonelier you become. When he was unknown, nobody noticed. When he was good enough, people doubted. But when he touched the gates of basketball heaven, people demanded he become a saint. And when he wasn't mature enough yet to carry that expectation, people turned away brutally fast. The tragedy didn't end there. Ralph Sampson, his perfect partner, the one who shared the load, suffered a serious injury. From a super team, the Rockets became a squad with Hakeem alone against the entire league. His only teammate vanished from the court, leaving emptiness not just in the lineup, but in Hakeem's heart. When Sampson sat on the bench with a knee wrapped in white, watching the team struggle, Hakeem felt pushed back into the same spot as that 18-year-old in the dorm, alone. No one else tall enough, strong enough, fast enough to share the paint. No one to split the pressure. No one to hide the truth that the Rockets were now just Hakeem against the world. And so every criticism came back to one man. Why can't he carry the team? If he's that good, why can't he win alone? Those careless questions turned into a weight crushing already tired shoulders. Every night when he got home, Hakeem sat in silence. Nobody asked if he was okay. Nobody told him one man can't replace an entire team. In that long quiet, he realized a bitter truth: the brighter the spotlight, the deeper the darkness behind you. Just like Simon Cowell's Ark, standing on stage with millions watching but nobody really standing beside him, Hakeem became the man placed at the center of expectation, yet abandoned on the floor, when all he needed was a helping hand. Early peak glory, instead of reward, became a glass cage trapping him between worship and loneliness. And in that cage, Hakeem learned what every legend has to pay to understand: talent is a blessing, but greatness is a curse. The better you are, the lonelier. And then, in the years when Hakeem was carrying a cracking team on his back, the biggest public tragedy of his life hit: a stab in the back he never expected from the place that once called him the heart of Houston. In 1992, while the Rockets were in internal crisis and sliding in the standings, Hakeem suffered a hamstring injury. For any other player it would have been routine. But for Hakeem, who had bled for the franchise his whole youth, it became the spark for a storm that blew up both his reputation and his heart. The Rockets, the organization he had been fiercely loyal to, accused him of faking the injury. They said he was dodging responsibility. Media called him a diva, selfish, putting himself above the team. Everything he had given for almost a decade was suddenly erased with one cold sentence: he's faking it. For Hakeem, it wasn't just an insult, it was betrayal. That pain was unlike any loss on the court, unlike careless fan criticism, unlike jabs from rivals. This was a knife from his second family, from people who had called him the pillar, from people he trusted enough to give his entire career to. Some nights he came home, took off his shoes, sat down and opened the Houston Chronicle. He read every line, every paragraph, every opinion, every accusation, and every letter cut: selfish problem, locker room cancer, faking injury. He held the paper, hands shaking, then tore it to pieces in the helplessness of a man who no longer knew how to defend his name. Not because he couldn't take pain, he had taken pain his whole life. But this was a different pain, the kind that makes a man feel like all his memories, effort, loyalty had been thrown in the trash. One night, after the whole team had gone home, the huge gym lit only by dim lights on the cold wooden floor, Hakeem stood alone by the rim. No ball, no sneaker squeaks, no coach yelling, just the steady hum of the AC and the heavy breathing of a man breaking inside. He put his hand on the pole, closed his eyes and said silently, I no longer belong here. That wasn't the voice of a rebellious star, it was the sigh of a soul betrayed. The Rockets didn't believe him. The media didn't believe him. Fans called him selfish. And when the whole world turned its back, Hakeem, the man who had carried Houston on his shoulders, suddenly became an outsider on the very ground where he had built his name. Years later, when asked, Hakeem still couldn't hide that pain. He once said, "I always played with absolute loyalty. For them to think I was faking, it almost killed me." In those days he arrived at practice earlier than anyone, left later than anyone, not to prove anything to Houston, but to prove something to himself, that he was not the person they accused him of being. Every shot was an answer, every sprint was a refusal to surrender, every drop of sweat on the floor was a declaration that his heart was still loyal, even if the organization no longer was. And right in that greatest humiliation, a new version of Hakeem was born, colder, stronger, more focused, more mature, a version that understood that in basketball, as in life, the deepest wounds don't come from opponents, but from the people you trust. But he didn't let that pain crush him. Instead, 1992, the year his heart shattered, became the starting point for the greatest rebirth the NBA has ever seen. And, from the ashes of betrayal, Hakeem would step into the brightest chapter of his life. And it was right in the ashes of that 1992 year, when his honor was pierced, his trust shaken, and his heart left abandoned amid accusations, that Hakeem Olajuwon found the only thing that could pull him out of the abyss: faith, not basketball, not fame, not the Rockets, but Islam, the thing that had lived inside him since childhood, but had never become a lifeline until that moment, when the whole world doubted him. When the organization he had poured himself into turned its back, Hakeem began a silent rebirth. No announcement, no press conference, no telling teammates, just him and God. He returned to Islam more strictly than ever before, praying 5 times a day on time, no matter the weather, no matter the practice schedule, no matter aching knees or burning back, reading the Quran every night, sometimes breaking down in tears at verses about patience and trials. And most of all, fasting Ramadan right in the middle of the NBA season. For a normal person, Ramadan is already a challenge. For an elite athlete, playing 82 regular season games and constantly traveling, it was a war between will and body. No water, no food, no fuel, only focus, discipline and prayers between timeouts. Many mornings he woke up with a mouth so dry his tongue stuck to the roof, his head light like it was floating, heart racing before he'd even moved. Yet he still showed up.
Still laced his shoes.
Still played. There were games he played with not a single drop of water in his body for over 10 hours. Strangely, those were the games he shone brightest. To him thirst wasn't the enemy. It was a reminder that the body does not rule the soul. Reporters started asking, "What are you doing to yourself? Why fast during the season? How does this help the team?" But Hakeem didn't answer, didn't justify, didn't explain, because what happens between a man and his faith is not for the outside world to judge.
Some teammates worried.
They saw him sitting quietly in the locker room, hearing sneakers and chatter all around him, but eating nothing. They saw him slower at morning practice. They saw his face pale as he arrived early just to kneel toward Mecca, and they saw him exhausted yet never complaining, never asking for rest, never uttering a single word of pain. But nobody truly understood. How could they understand that for Hakeem, who had fallen into darkness in 1992, faith wasn't just religion, it was the only pillar still holding him up. In his silence, he fought not only the media's doubt, but his own screaming body begging for rest. Every game during Ramadan was an invisible war, head spinning from dehydration, calves cramping from lack of fuel, chest burning and heart pounding as the body tried to compensate for what it wasn't given. But the moment the ball touched his hands, Hakeem stepped into another realm, one where only will and faith existed. If the earlier part of his life was a fight against prejudice, this phase was a fight against his own flesh. An ordinary person couldn't do it. An ordinary athlete definitely couldn't. But Hakeem was no longer playing just to win games. He was playing to prove that a warrior's heart isn't limited by muscle, but by belief and patience. There were moments during timeouts, when the cameras weren't on, when he sat with his head buried in a towel, too tired to lift it. Yet minutes later he walked back onto the court with eyes blazing like fire burned inside, and it was in those months of no sleep, no water, no energy, but overflowing faith, that the dream reached its final form. Not just technique, not just footwork, but spirit.
Strength that transcended the physical.
The rebirth of a man nearly crushed by the betrayal of the team he loved. In silence, amid doubt and ridicule, Hakeem stood tall. He didn't argue, didn't fight back, didn't apologize. He just prayed, then played on with the calm heart of someone who knows all pain must be endured before touching greatness. And from that moment on, the NBA didn't just witness the return of a superstar, it witnessed a new Hakeem, stronger, deeper, more dangerous. A man who fought not only opponents but his weary body, and a world that never understood him. A man whose faith had become both his only lifeline and the greatest source of strength he ever had. And then, after years of hunger, thirst, swallowing accusations and doubt, after sleepless mornings and nights of prayer that left his eyes burning with fatigue, Hakeem Olajuwon stepped into the era when the entire NBA had to bow. 1994, 1995, the 2 years when a man who had been disrespected, isolated, betrayed, rose to become the symbol of unrepeatable perfection. But no one knew that peak was built with blood, tears, and wounds that never heal. In the 1993-1994 season, Hakeem didn't just become the league's best player MVP. He didn't just become the best defender DPOY. He didn't just become Finals MVP. He became the only person in the entire history of the league to do all three in the same season. An unprecedented peak that may never happen again. Yet while America saw that glory as a miracle, only Hakeem knew what it cost. His body, already burdened by over a decade of running, jumping, colliding, fasting, thirsting, was sending pain signals at emergency levels. His knees swelled every morning. His finger joints ached so badly he sometimes had to breathe deeply just to grip the ball. His back felt like a wire stretched to the breaking point. Some mornings, trying to tie his shoes, he had to lean against the locker because of dizziness. But he still took the court. Not a word of complaint, not a word of explanation. Hakeem played as if his body no longer belonged to him, but to a mission. He played with the strength of a warrior but eyes that carried the weariness of a man carrying the world. On the court he was a panther's claws, the haunting shadow of every opposing center, the master artist of the dream shake. Off the court he was a son dying slowly from worry. In Nigeria his parents, the ones who taught him to pray, taught him discipline, taught him how to be a man, were growing weaker. He called every night, heard his father cough, heard his mother's frail voice asking if he was okay, and he lied. "Don't worry, Mom, I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. Every time he hung up he sat in silence, hands clenched white, guilt crushing his chest. He was winning the greatest honors of his life in America, while the people who raised him, the people he loved most, suffered in a place he couldn't reach. The higher he rose, the wider the gap to home became. The greater he became, the more powerless he felt. And that was the deepest wound. But the tragedy didn't stop there. While he carried Houston to the top, close teammates left one by one, traded, retired, injured. The team he once saw as family became a house losing bricks by itself. Familiar faces disappeared. Old laughter in the locker room was gone. Season after season, person after person left Houston, leaving Hakeem standing alone at the center of a fragile empire. And when the Rockets finally won the championship in 1994, the first in franchise history, while the whole city celebrated in the streets with fireworks, cheers, and crowds flooding every corner of Houston, Hakeem didn't celebrate. He quietly walked into the locker room while everyone else was still hugging and screaming. He sat down, head low, breathing heavy, body hurting too much to feel the victory. His heart didn't race the way people think it would. In that moment of absolute glory, the moment every athlete dreams of, Hakeem's heart felt strangely empty, not because he wasn't happy, but because that peak was too lonely. And just like Simon Cowell's arc, reaching absolute power yet with an empty heart, Hakeem understood that glory isn't the spotlight, it's the price you pay to stand where no one can stand with you. In 1995, the Rockets won again, and this time the journey hurt even more. They entered the playoffs as the 6th seed, the lowest in champion history. He was more exhausted, knees more swollen, his father sicker, his mother weaker, more teammates gone. Yet Hakeem played like he was possessed by something supernatural, every game a prayer, every point, a hammer blow against doubt. When he beat David Robinson, when he took down Shaquille O'Neal, when he carried the Rockets to the top a second time, America only saw the dream, the genius. But only he knew that glory was built from things no one else ever saw: tears, pain, loneliness, homesickness, worry for his parents, and a tired heart trying not to collapse. And when fireworks lit up the Houston sky, Hakeem once again stood quietly in the corner of the locker room, amid teammates' cheers, eyes closed and breathing heavy as if the entire season still weighed on his shoulders. The peak never made him feel whole. It only made the emptiness inside echo louder, because sometimes the tragedy of greatness isn't failing to reach the dream, it's reaching it, and realizing no one can stand there with you. And then after touching the summit of back-to-back championships, after tasting both the sweetest flavor of greatness and the bitter price of loneliness, time began doing what no NBA opponent ever could, killing Hakeem Olajuwon, slowly, quietly, mercilessly. In the late 1990s, his body, once a near-perfect machine, started rebelling against its owner. Knees that had been swollen for years now buckled on every landing. The back that had absorbed thousands of post-ups began aching like screams from inside the bones. His Achilles, the tendon that once launched him like a leopard, developed tiny tears, not enough to stop him, but enough to warn of the storm every athlete dreads. And Hakeem, who once spun in the dream shake, like he was dancing in mid-air, now struggled to lift his feet each morning. To play he had to get pain-killing injections before games. Many days the trainer had to massage so hard he gritted his teeth just to stand straight. But when the arena lights came on, Hakeem still walked out with that trademark calm, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The NBA had moved on to a new generation: Shaquille O'Neal in his prime, David Robinson still dominant, Patrick Ewing still tough, young athletic bigs flooding the league. While they were beginning their journeys, Hakeem was fighting not to be erased by time. The fans who once worshipped him started saying words that cut straight into the heart of a man who had carried an entire city: he's finished, he's old, he can't move anymore. Those words weren't meant to be cruel. They were just the truth spoken coldly. But for Hakeem, who had built his name on discipline, patience, and faith, they were the kind of pain that made him go silent. He never told anyone, never complained, never explained. But every jump, every spin, every sprint back on defense was a silent scream inside his body. The coaches saw it, teammates saw it, but Hakeem felt it most. Some games he held his back in the locker room for 5 minutes before he could walk out. Some days he tried to raise his arms to shoot and pain shot from his fingers to his wrists so the ball no longer left softly. Some nights after losses he sat alone in the training room, too tired to untie his shoes. And in those moments, when the whole world had no idea how much he hurt, Hakeem realized a brutal truth: a legend was coming apart piece by piece. But what makes this arc the most tragic isn't time's destruction, it's how Hakeem tried to hide it. While his body crumbled like cracked bricks, he still wanted to keep the image of a warrior. Whenever fans asked for autographs, he still smiled. Whenever reporters asked about injuries, he just said, "I'll be fine." Whenever the Rockets needed him, even if only a shadow of himself, he still took the floor. He didn't want anyone to see the decline. Didn't want anyone to see legs that could no longer explode. Didn't want anyone to see that the man who once terrified the NBA was now just a man praying his knee wouldn't give out on the next play. That's the tragedy no one saw: when pain doesn't knock you down all at once, but gnaws at you day after day, hour after hour, jump after jump, until you no longer recognize yourself. The peak that was once a gift had become a curse, because the greater you were in the past, the more it hurts when the present can't keep up with your own shadow. And as the Rockets slid in the standings, as age became the biggest enemy, as legs lost their spring, breath grew heavier, every landing a knife through bone, Hakeem understood that time, the thing he had ignored for 15 years, had finally come to collect everything. No noise, no warning, no mercy, just the cold truth that even a giant must one day bow to time. And in those years, Between dimming lights and a cracking body, Hakeem began the most painful journey of his life, the journey of facing decline. But he still stood, not because it didn't hurt, but because a warrior, even when falling, must keep the posture of a legend. And when time had taken almost everything, explosion, quickness, the magical moments that once came naturally, Hakeem Olajuwon stood at the final crossroads of his career, a crossroads that no one, not even he, could have imagined would become the most tragic chapter of his life. In the summer of 2001, as the Houston Rockets entered a youth rebuild, Hakeem, the man who had given his soul to the city, was forced to make a heartbreaking decision: leave Houston. No grand meeting, no proper tribute, just cold negotiations, numbers, averted eyes. And then the news broke. Hakeem Olajuwon signs with the Toronto Raptors. The press was stunned, fans were devastated, and most of the NBA laughed. He's too old, he's washed, he's done. Those words became the soundtrack around his decision. For Hakeem, Toronto wasn't a place to become a new legend. It was only a place to prove to himself he could still stand, still contribute, still end his career with a little freedom, instead of quietly fading away. But reality was 10 times crueler. The day the first photo of him in a Raptors uniform dropped, the internet, something he never cared about, mocked him mercilessly. People photoshopped him, turned him into memes, laughed at the old man clinging to the NBA. For someone who spent his life preserving dignity and staying silent amid gossip, the ridicule didn't make him angry, it hurt him. But that pain was nothing compared to the real pain waiting that season. His body betrayed him completely. At 39, his knees had almost no cartilage left. His back hurt so badly every jog felt like a jolt. His Achilles, once warning with tiny tears, was now stretched like a string about to snap. Even light workouts left him gasping. And every time the Raptors put him in, the Canadian crowd stood and applauded, not out of expectation, but out of respect for a man fighting something no one beats: time. But for Hakeem, every game was torture. Some nights after games he had to sit motionless on the bench for a long time, because his legs had no feeling. Some mornings he opened his eyes, and wondered if he could even walk that day, let alone play. And as always he stayed silent, no complaints, no asking off, no whining that his body was broken. He just tried one more game, then one more, then one more, until the truth became undeniable: the dream was over. No more dream shake, no more spins that terrified the NBA. No more roar of Houston, roar of finals crowds, roar of 1994, 1995. Just an older man with sad, deep eyes standing on the court, as if saying goodbye to a life that once fed him. And when the retirement decision came, it came without fanfare. No ceremony, no farewell tour, no tribute video, no lights, no fireworks. Just a short statement: Hakeem Olajuwon announces retirement after 18 NBA seasons, an ending unworthy of one of the greatest centers ever. Houston, the place he gave his youth, held no grand ceremony. Toronto thanked him with beautiful words, but couldn't give it the meaning he deserved. And so the career of a legend, who once made the NBA bow, closed in heartbreaking silence, not because he wasn't respected, but because everything happened too fast, too quietly, too opposite of what he had given. An empire ended in silence. No roaring cheers, no celebration, no blazing lights, just one big tired but unbroken heart walking off the court for the last time, carrying the sorrow of a man who knew life had taken the thing he loved most. But in that silence there was another kind of beauty, the beauty of someone who gave everything and asked for nothing back, the beauty of a warrior who knew how to retreat with honor, and the beauty of a legend who crumbled in the dark yet never lost the light inside him. And so after the day he hung up his sneakers in silence, the NBA lights went out, and Hakeem Olajuwon, the man who once stood at the center of the basketball universe, began walking into the strangest chapter of his life, the chapter of disappearance. No noise, no announcement, no clinging to glory. He left the world the way a ghost leaves a room, lightly, quietly, and without wanting to leave a trace. While many legends choose television, commercials, talk shows, or analyst desks to stay relevant, Hakeem chose the opposite. He vanished from it all. No TV appearances, no brand ambassador roles, no NBA commentary, no billboard face. He turned down offers from ESPN, TNT, NBC, NBA TV. He turned down everything tied to the spotlight that had once made his life both soar and suffer. For Hakeem, retirement wasn't the start of a new kind of fame. It was the door to the life he had lost his entire youth longing for: a peaceful life. He spent most of his time between three places: Houston, where his greatest memories lived; Jordan, the Holy Land, for his spiritual journey; and Nigeria, where his heart had never left. But wherever he was, he avoided attention like fire. He went to the supermarket early in the morning to dodge crowds. He entered the mosque through the back door to avoid curious stares. He worked out in his private yard instead of public gyms. Some called it reticence, some called it humility. But for those who truly understood him, it was the natural result of a lifetime being eaten from the inside by glory. His body, the weapon that once terrified the NBA, now ached every day. His knees had almost no cushion left. His back hurt every morning. His eyes had been fading since his final playing years. But unlike the Toronto or late Houston days when pain was tied to disappointment, now he endured it all in stillness, because his soul was held steady by faith. He prayed on time, read the Quran regularly, and in that discipline, he found what millions had once sought in him during his career: peace. Yet even after stepping out of the light, Hakeem never completely abandoned basketball. He only rejected the fame part of basketball, not the passing it on part. Remembering his early years in America, when he was lost, lonely, looked down on, and a man named Moses Malone reached out with 3 words: "Work with me." Hakeem understood one thing: greatness cannot end with yourself. So he opened Big Man Camp, a training program so private it felt almost sacred. No advertising, no media, no sign, just big men, centers, young players who came looking for him, knocking like they were seeking a teacher, and he taught them every step, every spin, every breath, every lesson he had learned through his own pain. Modern superstars: LeBron James, Kobe Bryant, Dwight Howard, Amara Stoudemire, Joel Embiid, Giannis Antetokounmpo, came to him not just for technique, but for something deeper: to learn from the man who understood the loneliness of the top better than anyone. But Hakeem didn't just teach them the dream shake. He taught discipline, he taught faith, he taught balance between glory and humanity. He taught keeping your feet on the ground even when your head touches the clouds. And sometimes when he looked into the hungry eyes of those young players chasing glory, he saw himself 30 years earlier, a lost kid in Houston, swallowed by loneliness, trying to prove he belonged. Years later, one player who attended Big Man Camp said, "He taught me the way Moses taught him, with the same strictness, but full of love." Because Hakeem understood better than anyone, the price of greatness is too high for others to pay alone. That's why he passed everything on, not to keep his name alive, but so the next generations wouldn't have to suffer the same pains he did. And so in a quiet life, far from lights and noise, living between Houston, Jordan and Nigeria, Hakeem still existed like a silent figure, like a mountain that no longer roars but still stands, a legend who no longer belongs to the court, but to the souls who come to him to learn how to stand firm against life itself. And as the post-retirement years passed, the silence Hakeem chose as his refuge slowly changed color. In his youth, silence was the peace he craved. But in old age, silence began carrying a different sadness, the sadness of time. Old age didn't come to Hakeem with gray hair or wrinkles. It came with pains that reminded him cruelly that his body, once an invincible fortress, was now crumbling brick by brick. His back hurt so much that every bend required a hand on his knee for support. His steps slowed. Sitting down was hard, standing up even harder. But what scared him most wasn't being unable to run. It was being unable to kneel. The 5 daily prayers had once been the rope that pulled him from darkness, the place he found himself. But now, every time he knelt, pain shot down his spine so badly he had to clench his teeth, breathe deep, fight, so his body wouldn't betray his faith. Some days he could only pray seated, a sadness for Hakeem that had no name. But that wasn't the greatest pain. What scared him most, what kept him awake, What tightened his heart was his eyesight. Past 60, the eyes that once saw the NBA from angles no one else could, that read game tempo so well they predicted every opponent's move, began to blur. Some mornings he opened the Quran and the letters swam in the light. He had to squint, bring the book closer, then farther, then closer again. Some days he had to use reading glasses, and when he put them on he saw himself in the mirror, a man fighting to hold on to the most sacred thing in his life. Once during a late-night prayer, Hakeem told a close friend in Houston, "I'm afraid of waking up one day and not being able to read the Quran anymore." A sentence that seemed light, but carried all the quiet terror of old age. Not fear of losing fame, not fear of being forgotten, but fear of losing the door that connected him to God, losing the language of his soul, losing the sacred root that had carried him through everything. But the spiritual pain didn't stop there. The relatives in Nigeria, aunts, uncles, cousins, childhood friends, left this world one by one. He got the news over the phone, sometimes at night, sometimes mid-flight, sometimes right after prayer, and every time his heart sank, because he knew the distance of half the globe wasn't just geography, it was fate. Hakeem left Nigeria to become a legend in America. But the older he got, the more he felt the price of that departure. Every time someone close died, another piece of his roots vanished. Some days he sat alone staring into the backyard of his Houston home, and said to himself, "I'm afraid of waking up one day with no connection left to the land that gave birth to me." That wasn't the voice of a superstar. It wasn't the voice of the dream. It was the voice of a man returning to the most primal fear, being forgotten by the very place that created him. He missed the morning calls of Nigeria, the smell of the Lagos Sea, his mother's voice on the porch, the sound of prayer echoing through narrow alleys. But those sounds now lived only in memory, because the people who made them were gone. And with every passing, Hakeem felt himself drift a little farther from home, not because he didn't want to return, but because the people he wanted to return to were no longer there. And so old age became the greatest spiritual tragedy of his life, not because his body hurt, but because his heart carried the fear of losing the only things still keeping him steady, faith and roots. Yet even in that fear he still prayed, still persevered, still read the Quran despite fading eyes, and in that perseverance there was a quiet beauty, a legend fighting old age with belief, with gratitude, and with whatever strength remained in his heart. And then as old age settled over his life like a thin mist, as the lights of fame no longer shone, as silence became his closest companion, Hakeem Olajuwon began looking back on his life, not through trophies, not through bronze statues or championship banners, but through what he had quietly left for the world. Because his legacy was never the roaring crowds, it was the things without noise, no scandals, no controversy, no life swept away by stage lights. Instead he left the world a rare model in sports, a human being who walked through greatness with dignity, through pain with faith, and through life with absolute humility. No drama, no scandals, no flashy lifestyle like many other legends. Hakeem's life after the lights is living proof of something few achieve, greatness without needing to shout. He lived true to the three values that built him from Lagos to Houston: faith, discipline, dignity, and those three values became the deepest legacy he left behind. When he left the NBA, Hakeem didn't use fame to make more millions from TV ads or podcasts. He poured all his energy into what he believed mattered more: family. As a strict but loving father, he raised his children, the bridge between Nigeria and America, in the Islamic faith he saw as the foundation of his life. His kids grew up not under spotlights, not at lavish parties, but in evening prayers, in the discipline he passed down, and in the simple yet profound lesson: dignity is the only possession no one can take from you. He didn't raise them to be basketball players. He raised them to be decent human beings, and that is the legacy he treasures more than any championship. While the next generation came to big men camp for footwork, what they received was far more. They learned how to breathe under pressure. They learned how to keep their mind steady under lights. They learned the discipline of a man who turned pain into art. And they learned what only someone who lived through betrayal, loneliness and harsh greatness can teach: how to keep your heart intact in a world that tries everything to make you lose it. Once when asked what he was most proud of, Hakeem didn't mention MVP, didn't mention the 2 titles, didn't mention the dream shake. He simply said, "I just hope I gave the next generation what Moses gave me, not just how to play but how to live a life of value." That is his legacy, not the stars he beat, but the people he lifted, not the lights he walked away from, but the souls who came to him to be illuminated, not the 100 million contracts, but the lessons of humility and faith he passed on through every handshake, every workout, every sentence as soft as wind yet strong enough to change a young athlete's soul. And looking back on his journey, from poor Lagos to the Hall of Fame, he understood something only those who have lived every up and down of life can understand. Real legacy isn't on walls, it's in the hearts you've touched. His legacy isn't greatness shouted on the court, it's greatness whispered, greatness written in silence, in dignity, in faith, in choices no one saw, in getting up after every fall, in values he placed above fame. And that is what makes Hakeem Olajuwon rare in a flashy world, a legend whose greatness, when the lights went out, remained completely intact. And then, when every chapter of his life had been written in sweat, tears, and the silence of a soul too used to trials, Hakeem Olajuwon stepped into the final stretch of the journey, a quiet, beautiful, yet breathtakingly lonely sunset. Not on a stage, not in front of thousands, but in the slow footsteps echoing inside an empty Toyota Center, the place that once shook because of him, that once called his name like a king's, that once was the cathedral of 2 championships, of the dream shake, of the days Houston lived and breathed with his every spin. But today there were only pale hallway lights, silent long rows of seats, and footsteps soft as an old breath. He walked past walls covered in photos 1994, 1995, the radiant smile of a man carrying a whole city on his shoulders. He stopped at one picture, him hugging the Larry O'Brien trophy, sweat mixing with lights, eyes burning with fire. Now those eyes were blurred, stinging but unable to cry, not because he didn't want to, but because he had already cried too much in a life that endured too many things the world never saw. This city, Houston, had once been his home, his pride, the place he became the dream. But now it had changed. Louder, younger, faster, and stranger. The people wearing Rockets caps on the street today may never have seen him play. The kids in number 34 jerseys only know him from YouTube. The old cheers are drowned in traffic, music, the sounds of a city that moved on without looking back. Not because they forgot him. They still love him, still worship him. But a legend standing alone in the place that once screamed his name always feels the gap between past and present deeper than any abyss. He walked to the tunnel that once led to the court. Back then every step here made the arena shake. Today it only stirred a little dust. He stood at mid-court, where he once spun, jumped, blocked, lifted trophies, and looked around. Empty seats, dim light, cold arena air blowing through, carrying the scent of a memory that had closed. In that moment he was not a legend, not a Hall of Famer, not the dream, just a man searching for a place to belong, after a lifetime of never truly belonging anywhere. In Lagos he left too early. In Houston he carried too much to ever feel part of it. In Toronto he was lost. At 62 he stood between places he once called home, but none had ever held his whole heart. And in a way that is the quiet tragedy of a giant reaching the top of the world, yet in the end still quietly searching for a place to be at peace. A sunset with no applause, no lights, only the shadow of a legend, long, lonely, falling across the hardwood of Toyota Center, where time had stopped just to hear his final footsteps. And then as his figure faded in the pale light of Toyota Center, as his last footsteps dissolved into the silence of an arena without cheers, the story of Hakeem Olajuwon, the greatest immigrant in NBA history, reached its end, not with fireworks, not with applause, but with the quiet weight of a lesson America must never forget. Because basketball has had Michael Jordan, the symbol of perfection, it has had Kobe Bryant, the symbol of unrelenting will, it has had LeBron James, the symbol of modern power and influence. But America has only one Hakeem Olajuwon, an immigrant who turned pain, exile, loneliness, silent wounds and unshakable faith into a legend that forever belongs to this country. The man who left Lagos with a trembling heart and family longing, arrived in Houston as a stranger misplaced in a new world, but chose to stand up, chose to rise, chose to fight even when no one believed in him, no one understood him, no one called his name. The man looked down on in dorm rooms, doubted the moment he stepped into the NCAA, called raw, slow, doesn't belong, yet turned it all into fire to conquer the toughest league on earth. The man betrayed in 1992 by the organization he gave his heart to, yet never fell. The man who played through Ramadan seasons without a drop of water in his body, yet stood tall. The man whose aging parents in Nigeria he couldn't be beside, yet prayed for them every night. The man who conquered the NBA not with muscle, but with a spirit nothing could break. The man who walked away from the lights without needing applause, without needing a stage, choosing silence to protect his dignity and faith, and even at the end of his life, still passing those values to the young, not with boasting, but with a hand on their shoulder and the words focus, patience, humility. That is the legacy America must remember. Not the stats, not the titles, not the highlights, but the journey of a soul from poverty to greatness, from fear to resilience, from silence to immortality. Because if there is anything Hakeem Olajuwon left for the country that became his home, it is the question he poses to all of us. What did you learn from this man? That strength doesn't come from muscle, height or opportunity, but from the pain we endure in silence. That true greatness isn't in the noise, but in how we get back up every time life tries to knock us down. That faith, whether religion, family or the values we hold, is the rope that keeps us from the abyss. That a man can come from a place no one cares about, and still become a guiding light for those who follow. And finally, that America, the land of immigrants, hope and opportunity, sometimes needs to listen to the stories of those who don't speak loudly. People like Hakeem, who turned pain into talent, turned loneliness into art, turned silence into legacy, and even as he walks into his sunset alone without lights, his story still lives in America's heart as an eternal whisper. Greatness isn't something you get. Greatness is something you become, no matter how many times life tears you apart. Throughout the entire story of Hakeem Olajuwon, there is a quiet sadness that covers everything, a sadness that doesn't scream, doesn't show off, but is so deep it forces the reader to stop and think about the real price of glory. When we look at his life, we don't just see the dazzling peaks like the 1994-1995 season with the historic MVP Finals MVP triple. We also see the wounds no one saw. The nights in a Houston dorm when an 18-year-old cried in the shower because he missed home. 1992 when the Rockets accused him of faking injury, leaving a knife in his heart time could never remove. Or the final playing years when his knees collapsed, his back ached every day and every jump was a silent scream of a legend coming apart. At 62, that pain didn't disappear, it just changed shape. Eyesight fading so badly, he fears one day he won't be able to read the Quran. Relatives in Nigeria passing one by one making home feel farther than ever, and the moment he walks alone through an empty Toyota Center, looking at photos of his glory days with stinging eyes that can't cry. America is a country that celebrates greatness, but Hakeem's story reminds us that behind the trophies, the statues, the applause, there are flesh and blood people who hurt, who fear, who feel lonely. The lesson for Americans isn't to idolize Hakeem, but to understand that strength doesn't come from privilege or physique, but from the ability to rise in silence like the way he turned childhood poverty, Houston loneliness, the 1992 betrayal, and the pain of old age into a life of dignity. Hakeem Olajuwon teaches us that greatness isn't winning, but keeping your faith, your heart and your humility, even when the world turns its back. If Hakeem Olajuwon's story touched your heart and reminded you to cherish the power of quiet resilience, hit subscribe to walk with us on the journeys ahead. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video where we continue honoring the great souls who walk through darkness to become light.